4 days on that cross ought to loosen your grip on that pen, girl, Cole Tate drawled, and before sundown, a stranger's answer would change everything in Perdition Wells. Rosalind Merritt hung from the crossbeam in the middle of Founders Square with her wrists lashed above her head and the noon sun hammering down on her like a fist that never closed her lips had cracked 2 days back. Her knees had long since stopped holding her weight, so the rope did the holding instead, cutting deeper into her skin with every breath. Around her, the good people of Perdition Wells went on with their business, ducking their eyes to the boardwalk, stepping wide around the square the way a man steps wide around a rattlesnake. He can't kill. Nobody stopped. Nobody dared. Horace Thorne had made very sure of that. Cole Tate stood at the base of the cross, with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, grinning up at her like a man admiring a job well done. His brother Jubal leaned against the water trough a few feet off, spitting tobacco into the dust and watching the road the way a man watches a road when he's bored of everything else. Merrick Skell sat his horse near the mercantile with a rifle across his saddle, and his cousin Dobbs stood in the shade of the awning, arms crossed, saying nothing at all. 4 men. 1 girl on a cross and a folded deed in Cole Tate's saddlebag, waiting for a signature that would never come from a living hand if it came from Rosalind's at all. "You had your chance to sign it easy," Cole growled, climbing the 2 steps of the little platform they'd built for exactly this purpose. This was not, after all, the first time. Thorne named a fair price for a ranch that's more rock than grass anyway. You spat on it. Now you'll hang here till you change your mind, or till the buzzards decide the matter for you. He held the paper up where she could see it, the ink of her father's name still legible at the bottom of a will that had somehow, in the 6 weeks since his death, sprouted a second signature. Rosalind didn't answer. She'd stopped answering on the first day, when answering only earned her a slap and a laugh. She kept her eyes on the horizon instead, on the long brown road that ran west out of town toward the hills, because looking at that road was the only thing left that felt like hope, thin as it was. And that was when the horizon gave her something back. A rider came down that road at an easy walk, no hurry in him at all, a rawboned buckskin gelding carrying a man in a weathered gray duster with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the glare. He didn't look like much from a distance, just another drifter passing through the kind Perdition Wells, saw a dozen of every month, men riding from nowhere toward nowhere else, stopping only long enough to water a horse and buy a meal before moving on. Cole Tate barely glanced at him. Jubal spat again and didn't bother looking at all. The stranger rode straight into the square and stopped. He sat there a long moment, gray eyes moving over the scene the way a surveyor's eyes move over a piece of land he's about to measure. The girl on the cross, the 4-armed men, the empty street, the shuttered windows where the town watched from behind curtains without once stepping out to help. He took it all in without a flicker of anything on his weathered face. Then he swung down off the buckskin, slow and unhurried, and walked toward the cross like a man walking toward a job he'd been hired to finish a long time ago. "This ain't your business, friend," Cole Tate warned, stepping down off the platform, one hand drifting toward his hip. "Best you ride on through and forget what you saw." The stranger didn't answer him. He drew a skinning knife from his boot, and in 3 strides he was at the base of the cross, cutting the rope above Rosalind's wrists with 2 clean strokes. She fell into his arms like a sack of grain, and he caught her without so much as a grunt, easing her down onto the platform, tilting a canteen to her cracked lips, before he even turned to look at the men who had put her there. "You don't want to do that," Jubal Tate barked, his hand finding his revolver now too. That girl belongs to Mr. Thorne's business till she signs. The stranger looked up at last, and something in his gray eyes made even Merrick Skell's horse take half a step back. She's not signing anything. His voice stayed quiet, almost gentle, the way a man's voice goes quiet right before it goes somewhere much colder. And you four are going to want to have a word with your undertaker. Cole Tate laughed, though it came out thinner than he meant it to. That a threat? He laid Rosalind gently against the base of the cross and rose to his full height, his duster falling open to show the plain walnut grip of a Colt worn smooth from years of use. It's a courtesy, he finished, low and even. Have 4 coffins ready. You're going to need them before this town sees another sundown. Nobody in Perdition Wells knew his name. Nobody would, not for a long while yet. Not until a rancher's daughter, half dead from 3 days on a cross, fell in love with the nameless man who cut her down, and the town he saved learned to call him sheriff. To understand how it came to this, a girl on a cross, 4 gunmen counting on fear to finish what murder had started, and a stranger willing to bury all of them to stop it. You have to go back 6 weeks to the night Amos Merritt didn't come home. Amos Merritt had built his ranch with his own 2 hands 22 years before, out past the eastern bend of Coldwater Creek where the grass grew thick along the bottomland, and the well never ran dry even in the driest August. It wasn't a large spread, 600 acres, give or take, most of it good grazing, and 100 acres of bottomland he'd meant to put to hay someday. But it was his, deeded and paid for, and it was the only inheritance he had to leave his only daughter when her mother died of a fever. Father and daughter had run that ranch together ever since, and if the neighbors thought it strange that a girl of 20 could rope a steer and read a ledger better than most men in the county, Amos Merritt never once apologized for raising her that way. She was, he liked to say, twice the rancher he'd ever been, and he meant it as the highest compliment a father could pay. Horace Thorne had wanted that land for 3 years. Thorne owned the Ashwood Range to the north, 4,000 acres of grass that ran clean to the territorial line, and he had built a fortune, buying up every small holding between his boundary and the railhead that was coming. Whoever held the land between the town and the water would hold the whole county in the palm of his hand. Amos Merritt's 600 acres sat directly across that line like a stone in Thorne's boot, and Thorne had proposed buying it 4 separate times, each offer a little lower than the last. The 5th time, Thorne didn't ask. They found Amos Merritt at the bottom of Widow's Ravine on a gray October morning, his horse standing riderless a quarter-mile off, his neck broken in a fall that Sheriff Loomis ruled an accident within the hour, before the body was even cold enough to bury. Nobody in Perdition Wells believed it. Amos Merritt had ridden that ravine trail 1,000 times, sober and careful, and his horse had never once thrown him in 20 years, but nobody voiced it out loud, either because Sheriff Loomis wore a badge. Horace Thorne had bought and paid for the same way he bought everything else in that county, and a man too plain-spoken about the sheriff's rulings had a way of losing his store credit, his water rights, or occasionally his life. Rosalind buried her father alone, save for 3 neighbors brave enough to stand at the graveside, and within a week Cole Tate rode up to the ranch house with a deed of sale already drawn up and a price on it that wouldn't have covered the cost of the fence posts, let alone 22 years of a man's life. She ordered him off her land. He laughed, the way men like Cole Tate always laughed at things that weren't funny, and swore she'd sign it eventually. Everybody did. She didn't. She worked that ranch alone through the worst of that autumn, up before dawn and asleep after dark, doing a job built for 3 hands with only her own 2, because hiring help had become impossible the moment word got around whose land it was. No cowhand in the county would take Merritt wages, not with Thorne's enforcers watching every road that led to her gate. She drove her own cattle to the water herself. She mended her own fences. She learned to sleep with a shotgun across her knees on the porch because twice that month riders came through in the dead of night, cutting fence wire and running off stock just to remind her what waited if she didn't sell. The barn burned on the 9th of November. She woke to the smell of smoke and the roar of flame already too far gone to fight, and she stood in her nightclothes in the yard, watching 22 years of hay and harness and her father's old tools go up into the black sky. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after so many weeks of fear, that Horace Thorne intended to burn her out of that land one way or another, and that nothing short of her signature or her death would satisfy him. She rode into town the next morning and stood in Sheriff Loomis's office and demanded he do something, anything, about a fire that every soul in the county knew hadn't started itself. Sheriff Loomis had looked at her with the particular tiredness of a man who has already decided which side he's on and merely wishes the deciding were over. "Lightning strikes barns all the time, Miss Merritt," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. "Terrible bad luck is all it is. There wasn't a cloud in the sky last night," she pointed out. Dry lightning was all Loomis would allow, and that had been the end of it. She wasn't the first. A year before, a laundryman named Wen Lee had refused to sell Thorne the little plot behind his shop where his wash lines and his boiler stood, land Thorne wanted for a warehouse he was planning near the future rail spur. Wen Lee had held out 3 weeks against threats and burned linens, and a beating that put him in bed for a fortnight, and when none of it moved him, Cole and Jubal Tate had dragged him into the square one August morning, and tied him to a rough cross under the sun, and left him there until the fear of dying did what threats and fire had not. Wen Lee signed before the second sundown. He left Perdition Wells within the week and never came back, and the town, having watched it happen and done nothing, learned a lesson Thorne had meant for them to learn. That fear ruled this county now more surely than any law. Rosalind Merritt had heard that story a dozen times in whispers, and she understood. Riding home from the sheriff's office with her barn still smoldering behind her, that her turn was coming. She kept working anyway. She sold what stock she could to a rancher, 2 counties over just to keep herself fed, patched what fence she could with what lumber the fire had spared, and reminded herself every single night that her father hadn't built that ranch to have it stolen out from under his daughter. She should not, in the end, have been surprised when Cole and Jubal Tate rode up to her gate on a cold morning with Merrick and Dob Skell behind them, and a forged deed of sale in Cole's coat pocket bearing a signature that was not a signature Thorne's own lawyer had practiced from an old letter until it passed for close enough. They didn't ask her to sign this one. They simply informed her, Mr. Thorne considered the matter settled, that the ranch was his as of that morning, and that her presence on it now amounted to trespassing on Ashwood land. She went for the shotgun on the porch rail. Dob Skell got to it first. They dragged her into town behind a wagon, her wrists bound, and they tied her to the cross in Founders Square, in the gray hour before most of the town was even awake to see it start. And Cole Tate stood over her the way he'd once stood over Wen Lee. And that a stubborn woman was still, in the end, only a woman. She hung there, through that first day, and did not sign. She hung there through the second, her lips cracking, her wrists bleeding where the rope bit deeper each time her knees buckled, and still she did not sign. Because some stubbornness runs deeper than pain, and she had inherited every ounce of her father's. By the third day, Cole Tate's patience had worn thin enough that he'd started talking about a fourth day, and a fifth, and how long exactly a person could survive without water in that country before the matter resolved itself whether she signed or not. And that was the morning a nameless drifter rode into Perdition Wells on a rawboned buckskin, looked at a girl dying slow in the middle of a town too frightened to help her, and decided the way he'd decided 100 times before, in 100 other towns, and always ridden on afterward. Only this time, something in him didn't ride on. Not yet, maybe not ever. This story still has some hard country ahead of it before it's through. Quick word before we ride on. Become a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name. It costs you a moment, and it means the world to a small channel trying to do this right. He was already crouched beside her when the shot rang past his ear, close enough that he felt the wind of it against his hat brim, and he moved without seeming to hurry at all, sweeping Rosalind flat against the base of the cross with one arm while his other hand found the walnut grip at his hip and cleared leather in a motion too fast for the eye to properly follow. Merrick Skell had fired first from horseback, and it cost him the only advantage he had. The stranger's return shot took him high in the shoulder and knocked him clean out of the saddle, his rifle clattering into the dust while his spooked horse bolted for the livery. Jubal Tate was already firing by then 2 wild shots that chewed splinters out of the cross a foot above Rosalind's head, and the stranger's return shot came a half-second later, a single round that put Jubal down in the dirt, clutching his leg and screaming in a way that made the shuttered windows of Founders Square rattle a little louder than the gunfire itself. "You're a dead man," Cole Tate bellowed, diving behind the water trough, snapping off 2 shots that punched holes through the wood a hand's width from the stranger's shoulder. Fair warning. The stranger put a bullet through the trough itself, through the wood and the water, and Cole Tate's forearm all in the same instant. And Cole went down screaming with his gun hand ruined and useless. That left Dob Skell, and Dob Skell had watched 3 of his partners fall in under 30 seconds to a man who hadn't so much as raised his voice through any of it. And Dob Skell, whatever else could be claimed of him, was not entirely a fool. He raised both hands, slow, let his revolver drop into the dust at his boots, and offered up the only sensible thing left to offer. "I surrender. God help me. I surrender." The stranger held his aim on Dob Skell a long moment, gray eyes flat and unreadable, and Rosalind, half-conscious against the base of the cross, watching all of it through swollen eyes, would remember for the rest of her life the way he seemed to be weighing something far heavier than whether to pull the trigger. Then he lowered the Colt. 3 coffins, then. He lowered the Colt. Might be there's hope for the 4th of you yet. The square had gone dead silent except for Jubal Tate's low moaning and the ragged breath of Cole Tate cradling his shattered arm. Windows that had stayed shuttered through 3 days of a girl's suffering began slowly to open. Doors began, slowly, to crack ajar. A grocer named Fitch stepped out onto his porch for the first time in a week, and behind him a school teacher, and behind her a blacksmith who had watched Wen Lee die a slow death of fear a year before and done nothing. The stranger didn't wait to answer that question for them. He knelt again beside Rosalind, checked the wounds at her wrists with hands that had gone suddenly, surprisingly gentle, and lifted her without effort, carrying her across the square toward the little clapboard building with a faded sign that read, Doc Harlow, Physician, ignoring Dobskell entirely, ignoring the two wounded men groaning in the dirt, ignoring everything except the girl in his arms, whose eyes had fluttered half open and fixed on his face, with an expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite gratitude, but something new, that didn't have a name yet either. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice a dry rasp. "Nobody worth remembering, save your strength." She would not remember, later, whether she'd believed him even then. Doc Harlow, an old man with steady hands and a reputation for asking no questions of anyone who came through his door bleeding, which, in a town like Perdition Wells, was most of them, worked over Rosalind for the better part of an hour, cleaning the rope wounds at her wrists, forcing water and broth into her a spoonful at a time, wrapping her sun-scorched skin in cool, wet linen. The stranger stood in the corner of the little examining room the whole while, arms crossed, saying nothing, and when Doc Harlow finally straightened up and pronounced her out of danger, likely to mend fully given rest and time, the stranger let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 3 days he hadn't even been present for. "She'll need a week a bed. Minimum," Doc Harlow allowed, wiping his hands on a rag, studying the stranger with the frank curiosity of a man who'd just watched him carry a half-dead woman through the streets of a town he'd never set foot in before that morning. "You planning on sticking around for it, mister? Or is this a ride-in, ride-out kind of favor?" The stranger looked down at Rosalind, asleep now, her breathing, even for the first time in 3 days, one bandaged hand curled against the pillow. "Haven't decided yet," and that was, though he didn't know it yet, the first honest thing he'd put into words about his own future in longer than he could remember. Outside, the town of Perdition Wells was discovering, in fits and starts, what it felt like to stop being afraid. Fitch, the grocer, had gathered up Cole Tate's dropped revolver and stood guard over the wounded men with it, awkward but resolute, while 2 other townsmen bound Jubal Tate's leg with more roughness than mercy. Someone had ridden for Sheriff Loomis, though Loomis informed that the man responsible for 3 of Thorne's enforcers lying wounded in his town square was still standing and armed and apparently unbothered by the prospect of a badge showing up to object, took his time answering the summons. By the time Loomis did arrive, ambling into the square with the particular reluctance of a man who suspects he's about to have to take a side he'd rather not take, the stranger was waiting for him on the boardwalk outside Doc Harlow's office, arms still crossed, that same. "You've caused quite a disturbance," Loomis ventured, trying for authority, and landing somewhere closer to nervousness. 3 men shot in my town square. 4 men. The stranger held his gaze. "You just haven't ridden out to see the 4th coffin yet. His name's Horace Thorne, and he's the one who ordered a girl tied to a cross to die in the sun for the crime of refusing to hand over land her father bled for. I'd start there, Sheriff, if I were the kind of lawman who still cared what the badge on his chest was supposed to mean." Loomis's jaw worked, but no words came out of it. Something in the stranger's flat, patient stare seemed to strip away whatever authority the sheriff had walked in with, leaving only a tired, compromised man standing in a street full of townsfolk who had for the first time in a long while. "That deed Cole Tate's carrying is a forgery," the stranger went on. "Miss Merritt's father never signed it, and I expect a lawyer with half a conscience could prove that inside a week, if this town had a court, that wasn't bought and paid for. You're going to arrest those 3 men bleeding in your square, sheriff, and you're going to ride out to Ashwood and arrest the man who sent them. Or you're going to explain to every soul standing in this street right now exactly why you won't. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Fitch, the grocer, still holding Cole Tate's revolver with 2 nervous hands, cleared his throat and pledged, loud enough for the whole square to hear, "I'll back you on it, Sheriff. Whatever it takes." And behind him, one by one, other voices started up. The blacksmith, the schoolteacher, a rancher's wife who'd lost her own husband's grazing rights to Thorne 2 years back, and never dared voice a word about it until this exact moment, a chorus of a town remembering. Sheriff Loomis looked at the stranger, looked at the gathering crowd, looked finally at the 3 wounded men in his square who represented, whether he wanted to admit it or not, the sudden and total collapse of Horace Thorne's grip on Perdition Wells. "Get them to the jail." Loomis said it to no one in particular, and it was, in its small and grudging way, the first honest order Sheriff Loomis had given in 3 years. Rosalind slept through most of that first day and woke past midnight to find the stranger still there, seated in a hard chair by her bedside, with his hat pushed back and his eyes half closed, not quite asleep, the posture of a man who'd spent a great many nights keeping watch over things that mattered, and had never quite learned how to stop. "You're still here," she managed, her voice stronger now, though her throat still ached with every word. "Figured somebody ought to be, till you're steadier. Doc Harlow's got patience enough without minding you through the night, too." She studied him in the low lamplight, the lines at the corners of his eyes that told of years spent squinting into hard sun, the gray that had crept early into hair still mostly dark, the way his hands, folded loose in his lap, looked like they'd done more violence than any hands ought to and regretted every ounce of it. "I don't even know your name," she managed. "Don't reckon it matters much. Names are for men planning to stay somewhere long enough to answer to one. And you're not." He didn't answer that, which she would come to learn over the following days, was itself a kind of answer. The only kind he seemed able to give when a question cut too close to something he hadn't worked out the shape of yet himself. She recovered slowly over the days that followed, the rope burns at her wrists healing into thin white scars, her strength returning a little more with each meal Doc Harlow's housekeeper spooned into her. The stranger came each morning to check on her, and stayed each evening longer than strictly necessary, and somewhere in those quiet hours, her asking about the ranch she feared she'd lost forever, him listening more than talking. Occasionally, offering some hard-won piece of wisdom about land and grief and the particular stubbornness required to hold on to both, something began growing between them that neither one named out loud, because neither one in truth quite trusted themselves to be believed in yet. He gave her in pieces, over several evenings, something of what he was. Not his name, that he still held back, but the shape of the life he'd lived, 15 years drifting from one hard town to the next, arriving usually just when some cruelty had run far enough to need stopping, staying only as long as the stopping took and riding on before anyone could ask him to belong anywhere. He'd fought in a war young enough that he still dreamed about it some nights, and come out the other side with a talent for violence he'd never wanted, and had spent every year since trying to put to some use that wasn't merely more violence for its own sake. He'd cut men down from crosses before, not literal ones, he allowed not until today, but men and women bound by fear and debt and threat all the same, in towns whose names he'd mostly let himself forget on purpose, because remembering them meant remembering that he'd left every single one of them behind. "Why do you leave?" Rosalind pressed him on the fourth evening when her voice had recovered enough to ask the harder questions. "If you fix a thing, really fix it, why not stay and see it stay fixed?" He was quiet a long moment, turning his hat over in his hands. "Because staying means it can hurt you again," he allowed finally. "Man rides on. Nothing's got a hold on him. Man stays. He's handed the world a rope to lead him by. I learned that lesson early, and it's kept me alive a long time. Sounds like a lonely way to stay alive." He looked at her, then really looked, in a way that made her suddenly sharply aware of her own cracked lips and sun-scarred skin, and the 3 days of near death still clinging to her like dust that hadn't quite washed off. And something in his gray eyes wavered just slightly, like a man standing at the edge of a decision he'd spent 15 years successfully avoiding. "It has been," he granted, "lonelier than I let myself notice, mostly." Word of what had happened in Perdition Wells traveled fast in the days that followed, not just through the town itself, where Cole Tate's shattered arm and Jubal Tate's ruined leg and Merrick Skell's shoulder wound had become the talk of every porch and counter, where men and women who had quietly paid Thorne's price rather than fight it began cautiously to wonder aloud whether the fear that had ruled them for 3 years might finally have run its course. On the third morning after the gunfight in Founders Square, while Rosalind slept deep and healing under Doc Harlow's care, Elias saddled the buckskin before first light and rode north alone toward the 4,000 acres of Ashwood range that Horace Thorne had built on other men's ruin. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, not even Doc Harlow, because some jobs he'd learned long ago went easier without an audience to worry over the odds. Ashwood spread out below a low ridge like a small kingdom unto itself, a sprawling ranch house with glass windows shipped in from the territorial capital, a bunkhouse big enough to sleep 20 hands, and outbuildings enough to service an operation. Elias sat the ridge a long while studying it the way he'd studied Founders Square before he'd ever swung down off his horse, counting men, marking exits, weighing the odds the way a careful man weighs anything he intends to walk away from. He counted 6 hands moving about the yard, none of them the caliber of gun that Cole Tate or Merrick Skell had been, ranch hands hired to work cattle, not enforce a land baron's will, and likely as unhappy about the second kind of work as any honest man would be. That worked in his favor. He rode down at an easy walk, no hurry in him, the same unhurried calm that had carried him into Perdition Wells 3 days before, and by the time anyone in the yard thought to question a stranger's business, he was already off his horse and walking toward the main house like a man who belonged there. A foreman named Buck Ostrander stepped into his path near the porch, one hand hovering near a revolver he wore more for show than use. "Ranch is closed to visitors, mister. It became my business 3 days ago in the town square," Elias said, and something in the flatness of his voice made Buck Ostrander's hand drift away from his gun rather than toward it. "I'm looking for a Strongbox, ledgers. A deed with a forged signature on it. You can help me find it, or you can explain to a circuit judge next month why you didn't." Ostrander looked past him at the 5 other hands who drifted closer, none of them reaching for a weapon, all of them watching with the particular stillness of men who'd spent 3 years uneasy about the work they'd signed on for. "Men like Thorne," Ostrander said slowly, "pays good wages for looking the other way. Don't pay us near enough to die for him, though." He led Elias to the study himself. The Strongbox sat behind a false panel in Thorne's desk, exactly where a nervous foreman who'd been made to fetch papers from it 100 times could describe it without needing to be asked twice. Elias broke the lock with the butt of his Colt and found inside everything a circuit judge would need to end Horace Thorne's reign over that county for good. The true deed to the Merritt Ranch, Amos Merritt's real signature intact at the bottom of it, and a ledger in a lawyer's careful hand detailing 3 years of forged papers. And a list of names longer than Elias liked to count, men and women across the county who'd resisted Thorne's expansion and paid for it in ways that had never once been ruled anything but accidents. Amos Merritt's name was on that list too, marked in the same careful hand, with a notation beside it that turned Elias's gray eyes cold enough that Buck Ostrander took an involuntary step back from him. It wasn't a question wondered, Ostrander granted. Man doesn't ask too many questions when the wages are good and the work's mostly honest. That kind of not asking is its own kind of guilt, I expect. I'll say as much to whatever judge wants to hear it. Elias rode back to Perdition Wells with the Strongbox lashed behind his saddle and the whole weight of Horace Thorne's 3-year reign folded into a leather satchel small enough to carry in one hand, and he understood, riding those last miles in the fading light, that the reckoning still to come would be worse for Thorne than any gunfight. Because a gunfight ends in a matter of seconds, and a ledger like that, one takes a man's whole life apart one signed name at a time. Horace Thorne out at Ashwood discovered the broken lock on his study desk and the empty strongbox within the hour, and received the news of his enforcer's defeat with the particular fury of a man who has never once in his life heard the word no. He rode into town himself 2 days later, the first time he'd set foot in Perdition Wells in nearly a year, having long since preferred to rule it from a distance, flanked by 4 fresh hired guns from his ranch crew, demanding to know the name of the drifter who'd shot down his men and the whereabouts of the deed that made the Merritt Ranch his. He found neither. Answer easy to come by. The deed itself had gone missing from Cole Tate's saddlebag sometime during the confusion of the gunfight, and the town, emboldened, now in a way Thorne hadn't accounted for, gave him only silence and cold stares in place of the fear he'd grown accustomed to receiving as tribute. He found the stranger in the end standing in the doorway of the jailhouse where Sheriff Loomis, under considerable pressure from a town that had suddenly rediscovered its spine, was holding Cole Tate under arrest, pending a circuit judge's ruling on the forged deed. "You've cost me a great deal of trouble, mister," Thorne rasped, reining up in the street, his 4 new guns fanning out behind him with the practiced ease of men who did this sort of thing often. "I don't know you and I don't much care to, but you've meddled in business that isn't yours, and I intend to see that corrected. Your business was hanging a woman up to die in the sun because she wouldn't hand you land that isn't yours," the stranger said, unmoved, his stance easy and loose in a way that experienced gunmen recognized uneasily as the posture of a man entirely unafraid of the odds arrayed against him. "That makes it my business the moment I rode into it. I gave your men fair warning of Coffins. I'll extend the same courtesy to you, Thorne. Square your accounts. Because a man who murders fathers and crucifies daughters for a deed doesn't get to ride home from this without answering for it." Thorne's face went the color of old brick. "You think 4 guns behind me and 1 behind you is a fair trade, drifter?" "I think," the stranger drawled, "you ought to look behind you before you finish that sentence." Thorne did, and found that the street of Perdition Wells, which 3 years of fear had kept resolutely empty of anyone willing to stand against him, had filled instead with a dozen armed townsmen, Fitch the grocer, the blacksmith, two ranchers who'd lost grazing rights to Thorne's schemes. Even the schoolteacher, with her late husband's old shotgun cradled awkwardly but determinedly in her arms, every one of them lined along the boardwalks with weapons drawn, watching, waiting, no longer willing to look away. It was Sheriff Loomis, of all people, who broke the standoff, stepping out of the jailhouse with a rifle he hadn't held with any conviction in years. Horace Thorne. His voice for once didn't shake. "I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Amos Merritt and the forging of a deed to defraud his daughter of her land. Your men will confirm it or hang alongside you, that's their choice to make." For a long taut moment, it seemed the whole square might erupt into gunfire all at once. Thorne's 4 hired guns tensing, the townsfolk holding their aim, the stranger standing perfectly still at the center of it. Then one of Thorne's new men, a younger gun who'd only signed on for wages and hadn't bargained for a hanging charge, lowered his revolver slowly and stepped back from his employer's side. Within a few heartbeats, Thorne stood alone against a town he'd spent 3 years terrorizing, his own hired protection melting away around him like frost off a fence rail in morning sun. He didn't go quietly. Horace Thorne was not, whatever else could be claimed of him, a coward, and he made one last desperate grab for the pistol at his hip. The stranger's shot took it clean out of his hand before the barrel had cleared leather, the gun spinning off into the dust. Thorne left standing in the street clutching a stinging, bloodied palm, staring at the man who'd just, without a single fatal shot, dismantled everything he had spent 3 years and 1 murder building. 3 coffins were enough. The stranger holstered his Colt, quiet as ever. "Turns out, you didn't need the 4th after all. Prison'll do just as well, and it'll take longer, which strikes me as the more fitting sentence for a man who liked to make his suffering last." The circuit judge rode into Perdition Wells a week later to sort out the wreckage of Thorne's empire, and Elias handed over the Strongbox himself, the true deed with Amos Merritt's real signature, the ledger of forged papers and bribed officials. It took the judge 3 days to hear every witness willing to testify, and by the 3rd day half the town seemed willing, men and women who'd spent years keeping their heads down suddenly lining up outside the courthouse to say, on the record and under oath. The judge needed only that ledger, and the sworn weight of all that testimony to send Horace Thorne to the territorial prison for the remainder of whatever life the law would allow him. He would die there 3 years later, the story goes, powerless and forgotten. A man who'd once owned half a county, reduced to a number on a cell door, and if there was any justice left to hand out in Perdition Wells by then, most folks agreed that was a fair enough measure of it. Sheriff Loomis did not escape the reckoning either. Whatever courage he'd found in that final standoff couldn't undo 3 years of looking away while Thorne's men burned barns and buried the truth about Amos Merritt's death. And within the month he turned in his badge rather than face the county's questions about exactly how much he'd known and when. Nobody in Perdition Wells wept to see him go. This story ends better than it began. I promise you that. One more thing before we get there. If these hard country justice stories are the kind you come back for, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name. It's a small thing that helps keep stories like Rosalind's coming. Tate stood trial alongside Thorne and was sentenced to a decade of hard labor for his part in Amos Merritt's murder and the forged deed. Jubal Tate, his leg never healing quite right, received a lighter sentence for a lesser role, and left the territory the moment his time was served, never seen in that county again. Merrick Skell, still nursing his shoulder, testified against Thorne in exchange for leniency and vanished west toward California within the year. And Skell, the one man who had surrendered that first morning rather than fight to the last, cooperated fully with the circuit judge's investigation, and something in him seemed, in the weeks that followed, genuinely changed by the whole ordeal. He stayed in Perdition Wells after his own light sentence was served, took up honest work at the livery, and more than once was seen helping repair the very fences he'd once helped burn, as though a man could pay down a debt of conscience. Rosalind never fully forgave him, but she came, eventually, to nod to him on the street without her jaw tightening, which was, in its way, forgiveness enough for a frontier town trying to heal. The ranch itself was restored to Rosalind's name within the month, the forged deed burned in the town square in a small ceremony that felt, to everyone who attended it, like watching 3 years of fear go up in smoke along with the paper. She rebuilt the barn, come spring, and half the town turned out to help raise it, hammers and lumber and casseroles arriving from households that had been too afraid to even wave at her a season before. Fitch the grocer extended credit without a soul having to ask for it. The blacksmith shoed her horses for free the whole first year. It was as though the town, having finally found its courage, meant to spend the rest of its days making up for every year it hadn't had any. The stranger stayed through all of it. He convinced himself, that first week, that he was only staying to see Rosalind fully healed, and then only staying to see the trial through, and then only staying to help with the barn raising because a man who'd been the reason the old one burned down. Each excuse held for a little while, and then quietly gave way to the next, the way a man convinces himself of a dozen small reasons, rather than admit the one large one sitting underneath them all, that somewhere in those weeks of quiet evenings and hard work, and Rosalind Merritt's steady, unflinching eyes, he had stopped wanting to ride on. It was Rosalind, in the end, who put the question he'd been avoiding since the day he cut her down. They were sitting on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house one evening in early summer, the new barn standing solid and pale against the darkening hills, when she turned to him and asked, without any particular ceremony, "You've been here 3 months. That's longer than you've stayed anywhere in 15 years. By your own count, I think it's time you gave me your name." He was quiet, a long moment, turning his hat over in his hands the way he always did when a question cut close to something unresolved in him. Then, for the first time since he'd ridden into Perdition Wells, he spoke it out loud. "My name's Elias," she smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile he'd seen from her since the day she'd woken up asking who he was. "Elias," she echoed, like she was testing the shape of it, deciding whether it fit the man she'd come to know. "Well then, Elias, now that you've got a name again, I expect that means you're planning on staying long enough to answer to it." "Might be." This time there was no hedge in it at all. No, 15 years of habit pulling him back toward the road. "Might be I'm done running from the notion of staying somewhere." The town, in its own quiet way, had already decided what it wanted from him. With Sheriff Loomis gone, and the county needing a lawman who couldn't be bought, bribed, or frightened into looking away, the town council, newly formed that spring, made up of exactly the kind of ordinary, once fearful townsfolk, who had finally found their courage in Founders Square, if he was honest with himself, had been half hoping for without quite admitting it. They wanted him to pin on the badge. He took a week to decide, though everyone in town, and Rosalind most of all, suspected he'd made up his mind the moment the offer came. He rode out alone into the hills above the ranch, the way he'd ridden alone through 15 years of towns he never let himself belong to, and he sat his horse a long while looking down at Perdition Wells in the evening light, at the barn he'd helped raise and the jailhouse where a corrupt man's tenure had finally ended, in the little clapboard church where, if things went the way his heart was already telling him they would, he intended to stand before a preacher before the year was out. He thought about the war he'd survived and the towns he'd saved and ridden away from, the graves he'd stood over without a name to give the people mourning beside him, the 15 years he'd spent believing. And he thought about Rosalind Merritt hanging from a cross in the noon sun, refusing even then to give Horace Thorne the satisfaction of her surrender, and how something in her stubbornness had cracked open a door in him he'd kept bolted shut since he was young enough to still believe roots were a kind of weakness rather than a kind of strength. He rode back down into town at dusk and found the mayor waiting on the jailhouse steps with a tin star polished bright enough to catch the last of the light. "I'll take it," Elias allowed. "On one condition." "Name it," the mayor returned. "That this town remembers what it cost you to get your courage back, and never goes quiet and looks away again. Not for anybody's threats, not for anybody's money. A badge only means something if the town wearing it in spirit means to keep standing behind the man wearing it in fact." The mayor pinned the star to his chest himself right there on the jailhouse steps, with half the town looking on, and if there were a few damp eyes among the crowd that evening, nobody in Perdition Wells thought any less of the town for showing it. The evening before the wedding, Elias rode out alone to the small fenced plot on a rise above the ranch house where Nameless Merritt had been laid to rest, and he stood there a long while in the last orange light with his hat in his hands. He told the old rancher, in words he never repeated to Rosalind, that he intended to spend whatever years he had left making sure the land Nameless Merritt had bled for stayed exactly what he built it to be, a home, not a holding, not a prize to be fought over, but a place where a family could put down roots deep enough that no baron and no forged deed could ever tear them loose again. He told him, too, that he was sorry it had taken a stranger, with no name and no home of his own to finish what a good father's murder had left unfinished, and that he hoped, wherever a man went after a fall like the one that took him, Nameless Merritt could see that his daughter had grown into exactly the kind of woman he must have always known she would become. Stubborn as bedrock, and twice as unbreakable. He rode back down to the ranch house in full dark and found Rosalind waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and a quiet that asked no questions about where he'd been, because she'd guessed already, and understood better than most that some conversations a person needs to have alone before they can properly begin a new one shared with somebody else. They sat together in the dark a long while, saying little, and it was, Elias would think often in the years that followed, one of the finest evenings of his whole life, the quiet kind of happiness that 15 years of drifting had never once let him imagine he was allowed to want. The wedding came that October in the little clapboard church at the edge of town, with the whole county turned out to see it. Fitch the grocer in his one good suit, the blacksmith with his family scrubbed shining clean, Doc Harlow standing near the front looking as proud as if he'd delivered the bride himself, and even Dob Skell standing quietly at the back, hat in his hands, having earned by then at least the right to witness a happiness he'd once nearly helped destroy. Rosalind wore her mother's wedding dress, let out at the shoulders where 3 years of ranch work had built strength into her that her mother's slighter frame had never carried, and when she walked down the aisle toward the man who'd once claimed his name, there wasn't a dry eye left in that little church, sheriff's star and all. I, Elias, take you, Rosalind." His voice was steady in a way it had rarely been steady before, not through 15 years of gunfights and graves and towns he'd ridden away from without looking back, to stand beside, not in front of and not behind, to hold this land with you the way you held it alone when no one else would stand with you, and to never again mistake staying for weakness. Because I've learned now it's the harder, better courage of the two. They built their life together on the Merritt Ranch that winter, the same 600 acres of good bottomland Amos Merritt had bled to build, and his daughter had nearly died refusing to surrender. And if the townsfolk of Perdition Wells ever wondered what had become of the nameless drifter who'd once ridden in on a rawboned buckskin and promised 4 coffins to men who deserved every splinter of the warning, they needed only look to the jailhouse where Sheriff Elias Merritt, for he took her name as readily as she'd taken his, in a small, defiant kindness that suited a couple who both learned the hard way what it costs to lose a father's land, kept a fair and steady watch over a town that had finally remembered how to be brave on its own. Rosalind ran the ranch the way her father had taught her, and taught their own children, in time the same stubborn love of land and honest work, and shared with them, when they were old enough to understand it, the story of the cross in Founders Square, and the stranger who had no name until he decided he was staying long enough to deserve one. She never had to embellish a word of it. The truth of that autumn, a girl who refused to sign away her father's blood and land no matter what the sun and the rope demanded of her, and a wanderer who finally, after 15 years of riding on, chose to stay and become the very thing this county had needed all along, was more than enough story to carry a family and a whole town. Into everything that came after, Perdition Wells, folks around the territory came to say in the years that followed, had earned a new name it never officially adopted but never quite shook either the town where the fear finally broke. And every person who'd stood in that square the day 4 coffins were promised and 3 were needed understood exactly why. It wasn't only that a stranger had ridden in with a fast gun and a colder nerve than the men who'd terrorized them. It was that, having done the hard work of cutting a woman down from a cross and standing against the men who'd put her there, he'd done the harder work still of staying to make certain it never happened again, and in doing so, taught a whole town that courage, once found, doesn't have to be lost twice. If this story found its way to you today, and it kept you here till the very end, that tells us something worth knowing. Become a channel member, tap the join button beside the channel name, and you'll be first in line for every story, like Rosalind and Elias's, that we bring you next. Thank you for riding this one all the way home with us. And if you ask the old-timers around Perdition Wells even now, long after Rosalind and Elias Merritt have passed the sheriff's star and the ranch both down to their own children, they'll tell you the story the same way every time, the way stories get handed down when they're true enough to survive the retelling, that once, then a town, too frightened to save its own, a nameless man rode in out of the empty road, cut a dying woman down from a cross with his own hands, and promised the men responsible 4 coffins before sundown. 3 were enough, and the 4th debt, the debt of a stranger who'd spent 15 years running from the notion of belonging anywhere, was paid instead in a wedding ring, a tin star, and a life built, at long last, on land worth staying for.